It began as a contest of necessity. In 1940, when the world tilted toward darkness, the United States Army issued a call: design a light reconnaissance vehicle, simple enough to be built by the thousands, strong enough to carry men and equipment across any terrain, and cheap enough to lose by the hundreds without breaking the war effort. The specification sheet was short, almost audacious: a weight limit under 1.5 tons, four-wheel drive, 3 seats, and an engine capable of climbing a 60% grade. 90 days to design, 75 to produce a prototype. Out of that pressure, the shape of a new military age emerged: the Jeep. The name was not official at first, a soldier's contraction of GP for general purpose, but the syllables fit the spirit of the machine. Its lines were utilitarian to the point of beauty: a bare skeleton of steel, exposed hinges, flat fenders, and a stance that seemed perpetually ready to lunge forward. No ornament, no wasted motion, only the logic of function. It was born from the collective intelligence of several companies, Bantam, Willys, and Ford, each contributing pieces of the design that would outlive the war itself. By 1941, production had reached a rhythm almost unnatural in speed. Willys Overland, adapting civilian tooling for the military's appetite, produced hundreds of vehicles per day. The Jeep became an industrial chorus, its parts interchangeable, its purpose universal. It could tow an artillery piece, carry a general, transport wounded soldiers, or ford a river. In North Africa, it charged through desert sand. In Europe, it crawled through the mud of Normandy. In the Pacific, it found itself in jungles so thick that its shadow disappeared under the canopy. Soldiers spoke of it as if it were alive. It shuddered under weight, but never quit. It rattled, groaned, and leaked oil, yet it obeyed every command. The Jeep was not a weapon, but it was a companion to weapons, an extension of the soldier's endurance. It required no delicacy, only trust. It could be repaired with pliers and wire, started with a shove, and run for miles on fumes. The vehicle embodied what American engineers called functional ruggedness, the art of designing something so simple that it could survive any misuse. It became, in the words of military reports, the mechanical infantryman. When the war expanded into the Pacific, the Jeep went with it, packed into the bellies of cargo ships, slung under cranes, and lowered onto black sand beaches. On islands born of volcanic fury, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, it faced terrain that seemed almost designed to reject machinery. Yet the Jeep advanced, hopping between shell craters, climbing soft ridges of ash, and hauling wounded Marines back from the front. Its tires, broad and deeply grooved, gripped where human boots slipped. In the Pacific theater, technology met geology in its most primal form: molten stone, sulfur, rain, and blood. Here, the Jeep's simplicity was not only an advantage, but a revelation. It did not rust as quickly as the intricate Japanese trucks. Its open design allowed it to be washed by tropical rain rather than choked by it. The heat warped the metal, but the machine endured. Where tanks bogged down, the Jeep improvised. It became the small god of mobility, indifferent to hierarchy, moving generals and privates alike. To the Japanese observers, who occasionally captured or glimpsed one across the front line, the machine appeared crude. They saw exposed bolts, a rattling body, no armor, no refinement. Japanese engineering in the 1940s favored precision, craftsmanship, and tight tolerances. Their vehicles were built with discipline: elegant engines, neatly machined components, carefully fitted panels. The American Jeep looked, by comparison, almost careless. Yet beneath that simplicity lay a genius invisible to traditional eyes. a deliberate acceptance of imperfection in service of adaptability. When Japan's industrial command learned of the Jeep's ubiquity, tens of thousands rolling across the world's battlefields, curiosity stirred behind the lines. Intelligence officers gathered reports, sketches, and photographs. A few damaged examples were hauled from battlefields in the Philippines and Burma. But it was only when one Jeep was captured nearly intact on an island near the volcanic chains south of Tokyo that the true study began. Engineers from the Imperial Army's Mechanical Division were summoned. The foreign machine, battered yet operational, stood before them, an artifact of industrial philosophy utterly alien to their own. The scene would later be recorded in field notes and post-war recollections. The moment when Japan's finest mechanical minds, steeped in the traditions of precision, first encountered the material embodiment of American pragmatism. The machine was not elegant, it was effective. It had no polish, it had purpose. And in that contrast, between the polished and the pragmatic, the calculated and the intuitive, lay the story that would unfold on the slopes of a volcano. The Jeep had traveled across oceans, through jungles and storms, to arrive at this point, not as a weapon, but as a question. Could simplicity defeat sophistication? Could a machine designed by committee, built by the tens of thousands, surpass one crafted by artisans of war? That question, unspoken and yet palpable in every glance of the engineers who now circled it, would soon find its answer not in words, but in motion, in the grind of gears, the flecks of steel, and the slow, unstoppable climb up the volcanic ash where all laughter would fade. War in the Pacific was not a map of clear borders, but a constellation of islands, each one a fragment of volcanic earth suspended in a hostile sea. The campaign moved like a tide, slow, relentless, eroding one stronghold after another. In this theater, the Jeep became the artery of movement, bridging the gaps between infantry, artillery, and command. Its tires pressed into coral dust, volcanic ash, and jungle loam, leaving a signature pattern that the enemy soon learned to recognize. By 1943, the Japanese High Command understood that the American vehicle was more than transportation. It was mobility incarnate. Reports from captured soldiers described endless convoys of them, darting across beaches under fire, ferrying ammunition and wounded with equal indifference to danger. The Japanese army, though disciplined and inventive, lacked an equivalent machine. Their light trucks, designed for efficiency on mainland roads, suffered in the punishing climates of the Pacific. Steel rusted, engines overheated, axles snapped on lava rock. The Jeep, meanwhile, multiplied. It was a mechanical organism reproducing itself across the front, carried in ships, reassembled on shore, and driven into war zones within hours. The capture of one, therefore, was not a trivial event. It was the acquisition of a specimen from an ecosystem that seemed to defy traditional engineering. The opportunity came in the spring of 1944 on a small volcanic island halfway between Saipan and the Bonin Chain, a bleak crescent of land known for its sulfur vents and black sands. The battle had burned for days. When the smoke cleared, Japanese forces found scattered remnants of an American landing party, twisted landing craft, broken rifles, and, remarkably, one Jeep that had rolled down an incline and wedged itself into a ravine. Its windshield was shattered, one tire punctured, but its structure remained sound. The engine still held oil, the fuel tank was intact, and the simple ignition system, to the astonishment of the soldiers who found it, responded to a turn of the crank. The machine coughed, sputtered, then roared alive, a raw sound against the silence of defeat and cinder. The vehicle was hauled to the rear positions, dragged by ropes and human effort across terrain that punished every step. The Japanese officers, pragmatic and curious, ordered it preserved rather than destroyed. A report traveled up the chain of command to the technical divisions on the home islands. A captured enemy reconnaissance vehicle, operational condition fair, worthy of study. By the time it reached Yokosuka, weeks later, the Jeep had become a curiosity. It arrived covered in soot and salt, the faded white star of the United States still faintly visible beneath layers of grime. Crates of documentation accompanied it, translated field manuals, fragments of American supply lists, and sketches by engineers who had examined it in the field. For the Imperial Army's Engineering Bureau, this was a chance to peer into the industrial soul of the United States. The war had already revealed much: the scale of American production, the speed with which destroyed equipment was replaced, the standardized designs that allowed parts to flow seamlessly from factory to front. But the Jeep was a more intimate revelation, a singular artifact embodying all those advantages in miniature. The engineers who gathered to study it represented the apex of Japan's wartime technical thought. Graduates of Tokyo Imperial University, veterans of industrial design bureaus, experts in metallurgy and mechanics. They were accustomed to machines that reflected hierarchy, precision measured in micrometers, assemblies performed with near ritualistic care. The American Jeep, when it was uncrated and rolled into the examination yard, appeared almost primitive by comparison. Its panels were stamped, not hand-fitted. The welds were uneven, the bolts mismatched. The body flexed under pressure. The seats were little more than canvas, stretched over frames. Yet even at a glance, something about its proportions felt inevitable. Every part seemed where it needed to be, nothing more, nothing less. The engineers documented every measurement. They weighed the vehicle, traced the path of each cable, studied the suspension geometry, and catalogued the metallurgy of its components. Notes filled pages of brown paper. The tone of the reports was analytical, but between the lines ran a quiet disbelief. How could such crude construction yield such performance? The Jeep had, by then, already achieved mythic status among Allied troops, but here, under the precise gaze of its former adversaries, it became an object of forensic fascination. The Japanese engineers sought logic where there was instinct, harmony where there was brute utility. Their examination room became a crossroads of philosophies. The American belief that strength lay in simplicity against the Japanese conviction that perfection required precision. As they worked, the war outside continued its inexorable descent. Bombers crossed the Pacific in growing numbers, supply lines frayed, the home islands braced for what was now inevitable. Yet inside the compound, amid the odor of oil and steel, the engineers pursued their study with almost monastic focus. To understand this machine was to glimpse, perhaps, the secret of the enemy's endurance. In one of the technical journals preserved from the era, an entry describes the captured vehicle with clinical detachment. Four-wheel drive utility vehicle, manufacturer unknown, presumed Willys Overland. Design extremely simple, maintenance easily achievable in field. Performance on uneven ground exceptional. Exceptional. The word carried weight. The field tests that followed would attempt to measure that exceptional nature, to push the vehicle to its limits under controlled observation. The engineers, confident in their theoretical understanding, chose the most punishing environment available, the volcanic slopes of Mount Mihara on Oshima Island, a place of smoke, ash, and shifting stone. It would be there, amid the black sands and sulphurous winds, that the captured machine would prove, or betray, the legend of its capability. The laughter of the engineers, recorded later in recollections as the sound of disbelief, would soon give way to silence. because once the Jeep began its climb, the line between the rational and the remarkable would blur, and in that blurring, the engineers would witness not just a machine in motion, but the ethos of an entire nation rendered in steel. Morning light entered the compound through narrow panes of frosted glass, illuminating the stripped carcass of the American machine. It stood on trestles, its tires removed, its body divided by chalk lines drawn directly on the olive-drab paint. Around it, the workshop hummed with disciplined curiosity. The sound of pencils scratching, calipers clicking, the faint hiss of acetylene torches. For weeks, the captured Jeep became the nucleus of inquiry within the Imperial Japanese Army's Technical Bureau. Each section of the machine was photographed, weighed, and mapped in cross-section. The process resembled an archaeological dig as much as an engineering analysis. Layer by layer, the foreign artifact surrendered its structure to the notebooks of the examiners. The first surprise lay in the frame. Where Japanese trucks relied on heavy box-section girders, the Jeep used pressed steel channels, lighter, cheaper, yet somehow strong enough to withstand abuse. Its welds were crude but deep, its joints braced by nothing more than geometry. The engineers noted with restrained respect that the design seemed to invite bending without breaking. The word they used in reports was forgiveness, a concept rare in machinery built to exact tolerances. Next came the engine, a modest four-cylinder block, simple valves, single carburetor, compression ratio unremarkable. Yet when tested on a dynamometer rig, it delivered power far beyond expectation. The reason, they discovered, lay in the cam profile and torque curve, tuned not for speed, but for persistence, a rhythm of low, reliable effort rather than brilliance. To Japanese technicians schooled in the refinement of precision engines, this philosophy was almost subversive. The Jeep's heart was not designed to impress. It was designed to survive. The transmission fascinated them most. It contained no exotic alloys, no unnecessary gearing, just 3 forward ratios and 1 reverse, linked to a 2-speed transfer case. The system could double torque at will, enabling the small vehicle to crawl up slopes that would stall heavier trucks. One engineer recorded in his notebook that the mechanism converts weakness into advantage, an observation that might have belonged as much to culture as to machinery. Day after day, the dissection continued. Components were immersed in oil baths, weighed against Japanese equivalents, and reassembled. Every part bore the stamp of mass production, serial numbers, standardized fittings, interchangeable bolts. Nothing bespoke, everything replicable. To a nation whose wartime industry depended on artisanal skill and limited resources, this interchangeability was both enviable and alarming. It explained how America could lose thousands of vehicles and replace them without pause. The Japanese experts prepared sketches for possible imitation. A few proposed constructing domestic prototypes based on the captured design, but there was no time and little steel left to spare. The examination thus took on a more philosophical tone, less about replication, more about comprehension. In one surviving memorandum, an engineer wrote that the American machine embodies the temperament of a nation vast and practical. Another noted, almost wistfully, that simplicity may conceal power more profound than perfection. These remarks, never meant for publication, reveal the quiet awe that began to replace earlier disdain. Still, to prove the Jeep's reputed endurance required more than observation. It required a test, an ordeal suited to the island's harsh geology. Mount Mihara, an active volcano rising from the sea south of Tokyo Bay, offered the ideal stage. Its slopes were a mixture of coarse ash and razor-edged lava fragments. The mountain had erupted only a decade before, leaving a landscape of shifting cinder that swallowed the feet of those who tried to climb it. The engineers arranged for a field evaluation there, sanctioned by the Army's Mechanical Division. The goal was scientific, to measure traction, torque, and gradient capability. Yet unspoken among them lingered a more human impulse, curiosity edged with skepticism. They wished to see whether the crude foreign machine, stripped of art and refinement, could truly conquer terrain that humbled even the best domestic trucks. In preparation, the Jeep was reassembled. The body still bore scars of combat, dented panels, scorched paint, but its engine turned smoothly. Replacement tires were fitted, the fuel lines cleaned. The Japanese mechanics worked with a precision the original builders might never have imagined. Each bolt was torqued to specification, each bearing greased meticulously. When finished, the vehicle gleamed faintly under volcanic light, a paradox of American simplicity restored by Japanese care. Records from the period describe the test convoy departing Yokosuka at dawn. Crates of measuring instruments accompanied the Jeep. Inclinometers, spring scales, barometers to record air pressure. The engineers wore field uniforms faded by years of rationed dye. The vehicle itself bore no emblem now, only a plain coat of paint, the color of dried ash. The journey across the island's winding roads marked the convergence of two industrial philosophies. In its steel bones, the Jeep carried the ethos of mass democracy. In the eyes of those who escorted it, the legacy of craft and hierarchy. They were, without intending it, participants in a quiet dialogue between civilizations conducted through the medium of machinery. When they reached the foot of Mount Mihara, sulfur rose from fissures like the breath of the earth itself. The engineers established their base of observation near an old crater lip, instruments aligned, notebooks ready. The machine waited, motionless, against the wind that carried the odor of burning stone. In that moment, it was no longer a prize of war, but a mirror, reflecting back to its captors the very qualities they had underestimated. Soon the ignition would turn, gears would engage, and the contest between theory and experience would unfold on the living face of a volcano. The wind on Mount Mihara was a living force, rising from the crater like a furnace breath. Ash drifted across the slope in sheets that hissed against metal and skin. Every footstep sank into the powder, releasing faint whispers of trapped gas from the last eruption. In this barren theater of smoke and silence, the test began. The Jeep stood at the base of a slope measured at 35 degrees an incline of loose volcanic cinder and jagged basalt. The mountain's surface shifted with every vibration. It was not soil, but granulated fire. Japanese trucks had failed here before, their wheels digging deep trenches that ended in black stillness. To those who had seen those failures, the American vehicle seemed too light, too fragile, too crudely made to fare better. In the manner of all military evaluations, the procedure was exact. Instruments were aligned, stakes hammered, cameras prepared to record the ascent. A notebook opened to a blank page labeled Trial Number 1. The lead engineer gave a curt nod. Another turned the hand crank on the engine. The first sound was metallic and coarse, a clatter that echoed from the crater walls. The Jeep's four-cylinder heart caught on the second revolution, coughing smoke and then settling into a rhythmic growl. The exhaust wove a gray ribbon through the mist. It was the voice of utility, not beauty, a pulse that spoke of torque, friction, and work. The driver, an Army technician trained for the purpose, eased the clutch. The Jeep rolled forward, tires biting into cinder that yielded like flour. It gained 3 meters before the rear wheels began to spin, sending clouds of ash backward. The observers scribbled notes. traction loss, 26 degrees. Yet the driver did not halt. He shifted into the low range of the transfer case, a mechanical gesture so simple it seemed improvised, and the Jeep moved again, slow, grinding, but unstoppable. At 15 meters, the slope steepened. The engine's tone deepened, the whole body trembling as though straining against the mountain's gravity. Pebbles cascaded beneath the wheels, but the tires clawed deeper, carving channels through which the machine inched upward. Every component flexed, every bolt carried vibration through its steel frame. The Japanese engineers watched through protective goggles, their expressions hidden, but their pencils motionless. The Jeep climbed higher, 50 meters, 70. The incline now verged on 40 degrees. The air smelled of sulfur and oil. The vehicle's open body was streaked with black dust, its radiator spitting steam, its canvas seats coated with ash. Yet the rhythm of the engine held steady, a rough heartbeat echoing across the volcanic amphitheater. At 90 meters, the slope turned treacherous patches of molten rock cooled to glass, their edges sharp enough to shred rubber. One tire hissed as a fragment sliced its sidewall, but the driver continued on 3 points of contact, steering toward firmer ground. The Jeep lurched, slipped, recovered. The laughter that had greeted its arrival weeks earlier was gone now, replaced by the collective silence of men witnessing defiance, made mechanical. When it reached the marked summit line, the driver stopped the engine. The sound faded into wind. Below, the slope bore the evidence of the climb, a pair of tire tracks etched through ash like scars in the mountain's skin. The incline measurement read 42 degrees at its steepest. No Japanese vehicle had reached half that distance. The engineers approached in small groups, their notebooks filling with numbers but not explanations. The machine, now quiet, seemed to exhale heat like a living creature. Its paint blistered, its axles streaked with dust. It stood not as a trophy but as proof. The test had stripped away all abstraction. Only performance remained. A second trial was ordered, this time with added load ammunition crates equal to 400 kilograms stacked on the rear deck. The purpose was to test endurance, yet beneath that formality lay a subtle challenge, to see where the miracle would end. Again, the Jeep descended to the base, the damaged tire replaced. The sun had shifted west, painting the ash a dull crimson. When the engine started a second time, the sound was rougher but resolute. It began the climb once more, slower under weight, yet following the same scarred path. The wheels spun, bit, and spun again, the transfer case whining like a tired animal. Halfway up, a plume of steam burst from the radiator cap, but the driver did not stop. He reached the same crest, halted, and turned off the ignition. The Jeep remained balanced on the slope, trembling slightly in the wind. Gravity seemed to consider pulling it backward, then relented. In the official report, the engineers described the result in exact terms. Vehicle maintained traction and functional power output beyond calculated limits. Structural flexion acceptable. Engine temperature high but stable. Performance anomalously efficient for design simplicity. Anomalously efficient. The phrase, sterile on paper, could not capture the impression that hung over the field site. To those who had built machines from blueprints of precision, the event bordered on heresy. The Jeep had proven that design could thrive on imperfection, that tolerance, both mechanical and conceptual, was a form of strength. The following days were devoted to endurance runs around the crater's perimeter. The vehicle traversed ridges of cooled lava, forded sulfuric puddles, and carried instruments over terrain where even men stumbled. Each evening it returned coated in dust, but operational. Maintenance required little more than tightening bolts and refilling fuel. By the end of the week, the Japanese engineers had exhausted their tests, but not their wonder. They could measure performance, but they could not fully articulate why it worked. Every hypothesis dissolved under evidence. The Jeep obeyed principles too plain to seem profound: lightness, balance, uniform stress, and forgiveness. In the quiet of the final inspection, one engineer is said to have placed a hand on the vehicle's hood and stood motionless, as though acknowledging an equal. The mountain wind answered with a low moan through the crater. The test was complete. The machine would later be transported back to Yokosuka, its tires shredded, its body scarred, yet its legend intact. The report filed with the Imperial Army concluded with a line devoid of emotion but heavy with revelation. Enemy reconnaissance vehicle demonstrates exceptional adaptability under extreme geological conditions. Design philosophy merits comprehensive study. Thus ended the ascent, not merely of a machine up a slope, but of an idea that resilience need not be polished to be powerful. After the test, the Jeep was no longer treated as a curiosity. It was tagged, photographed, and placed in a warehouse on the naval base at Yokosuka, one among thousands of captured objects awaiting study. Yet, within the technical community, its climb on Mount Mihara became an anecdote repeated with the quiet reverence reserved for revelations. The engineers who had watched it ascend the volcanic slope did not speak of it in public. Their nation was collapsing around them. But in private notes and later memoirs, the event survived, a moment when steel, ash, and intellect had met, and the outcome had humbled the witnesses. When Japan's surrender came in 1945, the Jeep's usefulness as a specimen ended. It was returned to the occupying forces and scrapped to clear space in the docks. Nothing of its metal remains, yet its trace endures in drawings, in typed reports stamped with the characters for "confidential" in the collective memory of those who learned from it. Its absence became its final lesson. A machine built for impermanence had outlived its destroyers in idea. In the years immediately after the war, Japan's engineers faced a nation stripped of industry and purpose. Factories lay in ruins, tools melted down, precision rendered irrelevant by hunger. Yet from that vacuum, a new vision emerged, one that quietly incorporated what the Jeep had demonstrated. Simplicity was not the enemy of excellence, it was its foundation. Post-war designs for small trucks and utility vehicles echoed that principle. Frames became lighter, maintenance easier, parts standardized. The ethos of adaptability, once foreign, became a national instinct. Across the Pacific, the United States demobilized its armies, but the Jeep refused to fade. It rolled from battlefields into farms, construction sites, and mountain trails. Veterans bought them as souvenirs of survival. Children learned to drive in them. Photographs from the late 1940s show them lined outside rural stores, their paint sun-bleached, but their forms unchanged. What had been a weapon of mobility became a civilian emblem, the people's machine of a democratic age. In Washington, military historians began to write about production numbers and supply chains, about logistics as the secret weapon of victory. The Jeep featured in those studies as a symbol of the American system itself, standardized, pragmatic, cooperative. It was not a marvel of engineering so much as a triumph of philosophy, the belief that enough simplicity, multiplied, could achieve the impossible. The lessons of Mount Mihara were implicit in those pages, though the Japanese names were omitted. By the 1950s, the influence of that wartime artifact could be traced in unexpected places. Japanese carmakers, rising from the ashes of occupation, produced compact four-wheel-drive vehicles built on the same logic: light frames, short wheelbases, engines tuned for endurance rather than speed. They were cousins of the machine once mocked and later admired. When these new vehicles reached foreign markets decades later, few remembered that a prototype had once climbed a volcano and changed minds. Historians now speak of the Jeep as a hinge between eras, the last of the purely mechanical warriors and the first of the globalized machines. It required no electronics, no rare materials, only the will to move forward regardless of terrain. In that stubborn motion lay its humanity. Soldiers described it as loyal, mechanics called it honest. To the Japanese engineers who tested it, honesty was its defining feature. It performed exactly as it was built to, no more, no less, without pretense or ornament. The story of the captured Jeep has been retold in technical journals, documentaries, and museum plaques. Each retelling smooths the edges, yet the core remains unchanged. A simple vehicle confronted a mountain and the expectations of an empire. The mountain yielded, the expectations did not survive. Out of that quiet confrontation came an unspoken exchange between two cultures. The Americans learned that democracy could be embodied in machinery. The Japanese learned that humility could reside in steel. Time has transformed both nations. The volcano still breathes, sometimes faintly, through cracks in its basalt flanks. Visitors climb its paths, unaware that, decades earlier, a machine once labored there, carrying within its frame the argument of an age. The wind erases footprints, but memory persists in the grainy photographs. A small vehicle dwarfed by ash clouds, tilted against gravity, frozen halfway between defiance and endurance. In museums dedicated to the Second World War, the Jeep is displayed behind ropes, its paint restored, its story simplified into captions. Few read beyond the specifications: engine size, wheelbase, production figures. Fewer still imagine the moment when skeptical engineers watched it disappear up a slope of burning earth. Yet that moment is the heart of its legacy. It represents the instant when technology ceased to be merely national and became universal, when utility transcended ideology. Every age chooses its icons. For the 20th century, the Jeep remains one of them, not because it was perfect, but because it revealed that perfection is unnecessary for greatness. It proved that design could be both humble and heroic, that the measure of a machine lies not in its polish, but in its perseverance. On Mount Mihara, that truth was written in ash, and though the wind has long since carried the ash away, the truth endures. The Jeep never laughed, never boasted, never despaired. It only climbed, and in that climb, steady, stubborn, ungainly, it carried a civilization's answer to doubt, that resilience, once set in motion, has no language and no flag, only direction.